Hello everyone, Patrick here of Unhallowed, again with my co-host, Lizzie.
Hey everyone.
And welcome back. This is episode 4 of Unhallowed. And correspondingly, the show notes may be found at unhallowedpodcast.com/4. And we're very excited to bring you The Signal Man.
And Premonitions of Death.
So you were really excited to talk about this one.
I am. I have never read the story before, and I saw the length and thought, oh, nice. Like, it's just a good bite size.
It is a good bite. We hope you've done your homework.
If not,
it'll take about 20 minutes to read.
It's not going to take you a long time, but it's a story that was written by Charles Dickens. I think it was written in 1866. This was really, I don't find that it is correspondent. Is that the right word? I don't find that it's similar to a lot of his other works that I've read. It really definitely has more of a spookier vibe.
Yeah, it's a lot more Gothic, although there are specters in famous works of his. A Christmas Carol.
The Christmas Carol. I always loved that one. Did you ever watch the one with the Muppets? Classic.
Decidedly not very Gothic.
Classic, though. So good.
Yeah, I always enjoyed The Christmas Carol, and Charles Dickens is, I would say he's probably one of the penultimate authors of the English language of all time.
Yeah, one of the most famous British authors. Everyone knows, I believe almost everyone knows who Charles Dickens is, or at least they know of a story. Just kind of throw it all into a little synopsis here, or at least to begin to kind of set the stage. So a signalman is a job that is associated with the railway. They would be kind of how would you describe that? They do the flags. Yeah,
they would signal to the conductors of the train and help them and guide them through the railway.
And it's it's almost like a switchboard area, or it's an area of danger or something to make sure that there aren't crashes between two or more trains, I guess.
Or people crossing the tracks or anything like that. And this was at a time in the Victorian era where railway travel was relatively new and it was expanding all across Great Britain.
Mm-hmm.
And it was often a theme in Victorian writing. The railway itself was the biggest thing that symbolized the trudge of industry. I guess you could say the forward progress of industry.
Oh, okay. So the railway was...
It was often used
chugging towards the future.
Something like that.
Oh, we're introduced a narrator,
mm-hmm.
and he somehow meets this signal man. We don't really know. I would say we are dropped into the story as quickly as we are pulled out of it.
And it kind of seemed to me there's maybe a sentence or two of clues as to what the narrator, who he is and what he's doing. And it seems to me that he is someone who is searching for himself, and he's walking through the country.
He's definitely more well off because he speaks about this signalman and his job, as well as the signalman laments the fact that he squandered away his youth and his opportunities in education. And the way that it's written about, you glean from that the narrator is of a higher class.
Yeah.
This was definitely one of the times in British history where class was very important, and your class completely decided where you were and where you could rise to within society. You get a lot of that within Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens, I feel like, references this class struggle and looking upon like the poorer man a lot. They do that in The Christmas Carol. They do that in, what's that other one called, with
Oliver
the orphanage?
Twist.
Yep, Orphanage with Oliver
In Great
Twist.
Expectations.
Yeah. So you can kind of pick up, so that's a clue that he's staying in a hotel nearby, and then he can at his leisure take walks around and come visit this guy.
But it also seems to me like he's not an uppity snob either, because on the second page he says, this is in regards to the signal man. It was a lonesome post to occupy, I said, and it had riveted my attention when I looked down from up yonder. A visitor was a rarity, I should suppose, not an unwelcome rarity, I hoped. So he wants to be greeted as a friend, perhaps.
He wants to chat with this guy, and he hopes he's not intruding.
Yes.
So I don't feel that he's uppity. Maybe I misspoke, but I feel that he's.
Oh no, I mean that's just like the stereotype of the time.
Okay.
You know.
He definitely has a different level of culture.
Yeah.
And you can see that a little bit later when he refers again to some of the other railway workers. There's a level too where that he's they're of a lower class than him. So I think that just kind of sets a couple hints that did you have another hint? Of
Yeah,
who
I
he
have
is?
another context clue. He says, continuing on with that quote, he says, in me, he merely saw a man who had been shut up within narrow limits all his life, and who, being at last set free, had a newly awakened interest in these great works. To such purpose I spoke to him, but I am far from sure of the terms I used, for besides that, I am not happy in opening any conversation. There was something in the man that daunted me. Which, I don't know, there's a really interesting dynamic here at play, because on the other side of that class wall, you also get something that maybe the lower class could relate to, but didn't quite understand, which is the expectations that come with being of a higher class.
Oh, okay,
and
I see.
having a predestined life.
I was gonna be like, how do you interpret that? So no, I totally get where you're coming from, and I think that there's a lot of levels. Like that's one of the reasons why I find Jane Austen's works and like Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility about women in this. It was a little bit earlier, I believe, but similar times, and how they, there's a narrow limit of what you're ever going to be allowed to do. And I just find it so, in a way, sad, but, I wanted to, in the very first page, so our narrator comes to the railway, and it's in a valley, a steep valley. And he's describing walking down to this little area where he can see, where the signal man is posted, and the railway goes into a tunnel.
And it seemed to me like, did you think that this valley was a cutaway? It's described as a cutaway. To me, it seemed like an artificial trough.
Yes, and it is actually, they do say, he does call it an unnatural valley later on. So I agree with you. It's definitely, it was blasted or dug out. Like this was not there. And so it is made for the railway, is what I took as. But, we were mentioning in Gothic horror, there's always the setting is very important. And I was just loving this paragraph while I was reading it. I'm just going to read a little bit of it and point out to you the definite Gothic horror description. So he's walking down into this unnatural valley, and he says, I resumed my downward way, and stepping out upon the level of the railroad and drawing nearer to him, he saw that saw that he was a dark, sallow man with a dark beard and rather heavy eyebrows, which I think connects again. There's always these like men or characters that are dark, heavy, sallow looking men in these stories too. I think they kind of described Manfred in the Castle of Otranto that way a little bit. But I'll continue. His post was in a solitary and dismal place as I ever saw. On either side, a dripping wet wall of jagged stone, excluding all view but a strip of sky. The perspective one way, only a crooked prolongation of this great dungeon. Ding, ding, ding. The short perspective in the other direction, terminating in gloomy red light, and the gloomier entrance to a black tunnel in whose massive architecture there was a barbarous, depressing, and forbidding air. So little sunlight ever found its way to the spot that it had an earthly, deadly smell, and so much cold wind rushed through it that it struck to me as if I had left the natural world. Okay, if there could be a description of a Gothic setting, this is just nail on the head. And I think this is one of an earlier Gothic horror work, would you say?
I don't know. I don't know yet. I mean, in our study of Gothic literature, our renewed study of Gothic literature for this show, it seems like the Castle of Otranto was early 1700s. And this might be like smack dab in the middle, kind of.
This was 1866.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to me, one of the biggest themes throughout this story is this juxtaposition of the old way meeting the new way. And we talked about that a lot in episode 1.
Right.
And you have, again, another juxtaposition between the natural and the unnatural. But the natural would be pre-industrial age man.
Okay.
And confronting the unnatural of man manipulating his environment even more.
But even this, the air and the cold wind and the smell and the dripping wet wall and all of these, again, is the natural world taking over something that is still man-made.
Yeah.
And making it so unnerving. So that's like, so
it's the in-between.
There we go. The uncanny. So I felt like this really kind of set the stage. Like this man who is the signal man is day to day, all 24 hours of the day, sitting here in this setting of dark and dank and dismal, and danger. And so if you want to look at this story on a reflection of like mental health, what worse place to live your life out than a place like this? So the narrator meets the signal man. They start discussing what his job is, basically, and then what's the next part that happens here? Well,
in their discussion, it seems like the narrator really gets to know a little bit more about the signal man, and it seems like the signal man did waste his youth. And in some ways, I thought of a typical millennial. Like a millennial, a young man, prototypically, or just like an adult child who kind of pissed away this time in college and really came to regret his life. But at the same time, I hinted off of a lot of these themes of Marxism and class analysis because Charles Dickens was more of a labor advocate. And he was an uneducated man, that formally uneducated man who came kind of from the lower class. But if you know anything about Marxist theory, there's really this detachment from, because Marxism, it's about the labor theory of value, in that workers are kind of being cheated and separated from the fruits of their labor. Okay. And there's passages in this story that really describe the signal man as not really performing labor in that he just really kind of sits there idle and doesn't do anything. And I keyed into that as being kind of a Marxist critique in terms of separating a person's labor, the product from a person's labor.
Okay.
And to me, it seemed like this is an unnatural job that could only exist in the modern era, where he's sitting at a switchboard and pressing buttons and tapping and communicating, because it alludes to like Morse code, and waving flags out the window. And it seemed like that was part of the loneliness, is this separation from the fruits of your labor.
That's a great connection to our modern day and our reliance on technology and social media, and this, social dilemma Netflix thing that just came out and, has really caused a stir in people, because I really think it's making a bit more mainstream what a lot of, at least Pat and I have felt for quite some time, that you have to be quite aware of social media, what you're putting on social media. And because it creates this facade, and you're separated from a character that you create for yourself, and that these people like, influencers create an entire world, and they're earning income, but they're not the same person. Like, we see Photoshop, we see filters and ads and all these fake things that are completely separate. Like, you are not the person that you're portraying.
As we have our podcast where we're personas.
Gotcha.
But you're right. There's a lot of parallels between the Industrial Revolution and the digital age.
Absolutely.
Because we're in that period of transition right now.
It's completely revolutionizing the entire world again. And we only are accelerating the advancements that we will see. And we're just right in that climb, up to the climax of what's going to be possible for us. So I find the Industrial Revolution so interesting. Like, I just love reading about this time frame. And so I think that this was such an interesting story, in that aspect.
Well, I think it's so interesting too, because we were talking, you were specifically mentioning how people were so trapped in their classes. And although I think there were definitely growing pains and bad things about the Industrial Revolution, I mean, there's no greater instrument of societal and cultural change than the the Industrial Revolution, because before, women's suffrage wasn't a thing. People were trapped in their classes. And then it's the excesses that are created by changes in capital that produce class mobility.
Oh, absolutely.
And women's liberation and all these different things. So these critiques are funny for me in a way. Like, at the time it seems bad, but through the chaos of change.
Right. Well, I guess you kind of have to look at it both ways. And look at the fact that for certain people, they could never get out of where they were. But
we've strayed a little bit from the plot of the story. Well, one thing I wanted to key on, and maybe you can riff off this, is that he's really uneasy. And when the
narrator?
No, the signal man.
Okay.
And when the narrator's calling down to him, what happens?
He's like, "Don't call to me."
Yeah.
And he gets really freaked out by him.
The signal man does.
The signal man gets really freaked out by the narrator calling down to him and talking to him. And he waves at him to get his attention. And he's like, "Don't wave at me. Don't do this." And then he says to him, like, "Have I seen you before?" And the narrator's like, "No, absolutely not. You couldn't have." And the narrator's like, why are you looking at me like you know me, and that you're afraid of me?" And the signal man's like, "I could have sworn I know you from somewhere." Like, and he's super uneasy. And anyway, they kind of are able to shake that off. And then they start talking about how the signal man came to be here. I like that the signal man uses this thing where he says that he had been a student when he was young of like the natural philosophy. He'd attended his lectures, but he had run wild, misused his opportunities, gone down, and never risen again. He had no complaint to offer about that. He had made his bed, and he lay upon it. It was far too late to make another. I just love that phrasing. Like, that's just, there's something about that you can really feel that the signal man's, he's set where he's at. He knows that he has no way out. This is what he does and where he's going to be. And maybe this finality of his position in his life is connected to what is happening to him.
Oh, that's a good point.
Or maybe he's, kind of just like situationally depressed because of like what's going on. But he basically, they have this cool little chat. They're talking about what they do. And then they separate. And before they leave, before the narrator leaves, the signal man stays. The signal man requests that if the narrator does come back, which the narrator asked if he could, that he doesn't call down to him and that he doesn't wave to him and try to get his attention like he did the first time. And then he says, okay, I suppose I can do that for you. He wishes that they wish goodnight and they separate until the next day. And
on the next day, he comes down and they start to have more conversations. And during this conversation, when he comes down, the narrator doesn't say anything, but just kind of makes his way zigzagging down the cut and gets to the bottom.
And they see each other and they do that bro nod. And then
they do a bro nod.
And then they start chatting and he's like, I didn't call out to you.
Can I talk now?
He's like, I didn't call out to you. And he's like, yeah, thanks. And then it seems that sort of instance of A, the narrator coming back, and B, the narrator doing what the signal man's asking. And I don't know if like class or whatever plays into this, that maybe more of a gentleman or a higher rank would respect you enough to do that. I don't know. But it lays a level of trust that the signal man decides he's going to reveal what has him all freaked out and uneasy and why he was asking the narrator not to call down to him.
But before the signal man explains things, am I right that it's the second meeting where the narrator is in the hut with him and watching him do his duties? And there's certain times where they're talking and the signal man just stops and he looks down the tunnel.
Well, yeah.
And doesn't say anything?
Yeah, but this is in the second meeting. In the first meeting, he does look.
Does that happen in the first meeting?
He looks at the light.
He'll be talking and then he just stops.
Because I think there's a red light, and when the train's coming, the light will turn on and as a warning. And he looks at the light a couple times and turns his head, but nothing, And so this continues to happen in the second meeting. But as well, the signal man decides to tell him why he's behaving sort of strangely, why he first looked upon the narrator with dread, they call it, and what has him so depressed, I guess.
This kind of reminds me of The Lighthouse with the guy from Twilight.
Robert Pattinson and Willem Dafoe. Whom
my grandmother babysat when he was a baby in Appleton, Wisconsin.
Yep,
I have to share that.
You gotta throw that in there.
I do.
That is such a fun. They were neighbors, and Pat's grandma was a little bit older than Willem Dafoe. Willem Dafoe has some brothers and sisters too. Yep. And yeah.
Just a funny aside here. I have to, every time Willem Dafoe comes up, I have to share this. But the Dafoes, his dad was a doctor, and he was like the town doctor in Appleton. And he had a bunch of older sisters, I think. And my grandma would babysit them when he was just like a small baby. And
change his diapers.
I think so.
She said that.
Did she say that?
Did.
Funny. And my grandma's she's such a sweetheart. And I told her, I don't know if you were here for this, but I told her that he had gotten in trouble in high school for being involved in some risque productions. I remember reading this. Don't take it for as gospel, but that he had gotten involved in some like quasi pornographic films in high school and like as a young man, and she thought that was so funny.
You're like, oh well, I've seen him in his diaper, so.
Well, and she, I mean, it's funny because he's gone on to be one of like the quintessential, like one of the best actors of our time.
I find him to be a very good actor. I enjoy seeing him in things, and whether it's the Spider-Man movie or what's that one called? The
Antichrist.
No, the one where he's a hitman. Like he's a assassin.
It's not the Boondock Saints, right?
Well, isn't he in that too?
He's in Daybreakers. He's a vampire hunter.
Gosh, it'll come to me when we're done with this, or like right when I'm about to fall asleep, and I'll be like,
that happens.
Damn it.
With everyone.
So
every podcast.
Anyway, before I just talk with you about Willem Dafoe for the rest of the night, how does it remind you of The Lighthouse?
Well, it's just the air feels the same. There's a mysterious air, and the
one
setting
knows more than the other.
Yeah, actually. And well, in The Lighthouse, I guess there's a younger man and an older protege, and the younger man's trying to learn things. I mean, the dynamic isn't the same. There doesn't seem to be too much of a class thing. One takes place in the United States and the other, but I don't know. It just, for some reason, it made me think about it.
Kind of feels that if you haven't seen that, that's a fantastic movie.
We might have to do it.
Absolutely. So basically the reveal, are you guys ready? So the reveal, he reveals that he has had these premonitions and he's seeing these ghosts. And so one night he's sitting there and he hears someone say, like, call to him, just like the narrator did. And he hears like, look out, like below there, like look out. And he sees this ghost and he like goes up to it and then it's gone. And then he sees these, what is it? He sees blood or he sees something. But anyway, he feels that it's been a train crash. And then a train crash happens the next day. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I love this next little part here. I've just been like waiting to read this part because this is such a good example of kind of how I feel when something like creepy happens and you react physically to it. So it begins, resisting the slow touch of a frozen finger tracing out my spine. I showed him how that this figure must be a deception of his sense of sight, and how that figures, originating in disease of the delicate nerves that minister to the functions of the eye, were known to have often troubled patients, some of whom had become conscious of the nature of their affliction, and had even proved it by experiments upon themselves. And so they're sitting in the wind and speaking quietly to each other. And he feels the slow touch of a frozen finger tracing out his spine. And, you get that feeling where you get the chills and your hair stands up on end when someone's telling you something scary. And I just really liked that description there. And also, I think that's another clue. He's talking about diseases of the delicate nerves and patients and experiments. So either he, is in a situation where he's reading about these things, or he's actually in that field himself. So I think that's another clue as to who the narrator is. So we continue, and he's saying that he's like the lights turning on, basically, and he's hearing the bell that would announce a train. So he, generally he sees another ghost, and it's the ghost of like a woman. And then the next day, a woman dies in front of the train. And so, he's now had 2 interactions with specters, 2 premonitions of a happening of a ghost, and both of them have come true. The narrator is freaked out. He's discussing with the signal man, and they basically, or at least the narrator comes to the result that he must be seeing things. This stuff couldn't be happening. But the signal man's like, no, these things are happening to me, and it's happening again. I am hearing things call out to me. I'm seeing a figure waving at me, calling to me. It's ringing my bell, and it's doing the light. And then all of a sudden the narrator catches on that the odd behavior of like the day before with the signal man looking away at the light and at the bell is because he's seeing it happening. And so the narrator's like adamant. He was like, dude, I was there with you. There was no bell ringing. There was no light going off. This obviously is, you're in a freaky place. You've had these bad things happen. You're telling me that you're down in the dumps. This is what's going on. These things are miscommunicating with you, and it's all in your head because I was here and that absolutely did not happen.
And he tries to convince him using logic and science and reason. And I thought that was also, well, this isn't my original thought, but I read it in a piece about this, about how it represents the meeting of confronting superstition with science in this time, where people are starting to understand the mysteries of the human body, the mysteries of the natural world, and starting to harness its power. And that was another thing that people had caught on and talked about in this story.
And there's a lot of like pseudoscience at this time too, that we sort of talked about a little bit before. The phrenology, seances, and these things that were logical. They believed it was logical. And now we're saying, oh, that's just pseudoscience. And it just makes me think, what in the next 50, 100 years is going to be our pseudoscience. But, besides that.
And it seems to me like the signal man, he knows it's going to happen a third time. And he's trying to do all these things and talk about how helpless he is to prevent anything, even though he's trying to prevent everything.
Right.
And 3 is the magic number. And I wonder if that's kind of a hearkening to Shakespeare in Hamlet, maybe. This is the second time we're drawing the comparison.
Well, aren't there 3 ghosts in the Christmas Carol too?
Oh, right. Yeah, that's true. The 3 is the magic number.
It always is creepy because it's like 3 is the witching hour. 3 is the inverse of God, Christ, and the Holy Ghost.
Oh, yeah, the Holy Trinity.
So, yeah, 3 is important. You see 3 in everything.
3 strikes, you're out.
There you go. You're on your second strike, bro.
It's baseball. I just, to finish that thought, though, sorry. It seems emblematic of this idea of people being trapped, not only in their class, but also being trapped in the trudge forward of industry. And I wanted to drive home the parallel that we're facing right now with the coronavirus.
Oh,
and
dear.
People feeling, it's about to get real heavy.
Oh, geez.
But people feeling trapped and helpless about what to do about the situation.
Oh, I absolutely agree. I spoke with my coworkers today about how, we're all these totally different people in completely different points in our lives, and how we're just sitting there saying, what's the truth? You're caught in between one side and the other side, whether it be politically or the how you feel about the virus itself and what we should be doing about it. But what's the truth? What's the absolute truth? And the way the news is presented in social media, like everything's so objective and based on opinion and seen through a filter. Like, what is the truth? So
everything's so subjective.
Absolutely. Going on to like that kind of note where we're deciding like whether or not this could be some like mental health thing. He is saying, the signal man is saying, what's this warning against? And he gets all ramped up and he's like, his eyes were on fire, it says. And he's like, what is the danger? Where's the danger? There's danger overhanging. It is somewhere here. A calamity will happen. It is not to be doubted this first time after what has gone before. It is a cruel haunting of me. What can I do? And he's like sweating and the fire in his eyes, and he's like pushing his hair back and like racing around in feverish distress and pacing the floor. A poor mere signalman at a solitary station. Why not go with someone with credit to be believed and a power to act? And I mean, this guy is just absolutely at his wit's end. The description here is so, and the description of what he's saying and his actions and their dialogue just really truly sets up how he is absolutely at the end of his rope.
And you see this, there's a progression too, because the first time they meet on page 3, at least in my ebook version, the narrator describes him thusly. The monstrous thought came into my mind as I perused the fixed eyes and the saturnine face that this was a spirit and not a man. I've speculated since whether there may have been infection in his mind. So I think that, it also goes to how we were talking about Manfred kind of being like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where this is another in-between moment where he's some kind of a fiend.
Right. He's not, he doesn't appear real. And it, I mean, at the end of the story, you almost wonder, obviously there is a moment in this next page here where we, after the narrator and the signalman part for a second time, he comes back in the morning, or actually it's the next evening, and he sees all of these men in the mouth of the tunnel, and he thinks for a second, holy crap, like there's the ghosts that the signalman's like talking about, like here are the actual ghosts. I'm seeing it. And then he realizes with like horror that there is like a body there covered on a gurney, a wooden gurney with a tarp over it. And he realizes there's been like a death, and he goes down there and they show him that it's the signalman, and the signalman was killed. And so then you're proven that the signalman was real because there's other people there. But it almost makes you feel for a second that our narrator was...
Oh, maybe he was hallucinating the whole thing the whole time.
Right.
M. Night Shyamalan.
Ding-a-dong. Like there's a moment there I felt as I was reading it where he's talking about this, and for a second you're almost like, well, is the guy even real? So basically they say there's all these workers down there, and they say that the signalman was cut down by an engine, and they say no man in England knew his work better than this signalman, but somehow he was not clear of the outer rail. It was just a broad day. He had struck down the light. He had the lamp in his hand. The engine came out of the tunnel. His back was towards it, and she cut him down. And so he knew his job. And was he distracted by the ghost again? Or was it the fact that he had told the narrator coming in and all of these specters that he'd been seeing that he was going to ignore the calling, ignore the warning, and that ended up being his doom? But he does describe, though, that there was really no way for him to change the events of the train wreck and then the death of the woman. There was nothing for him to do. What was he going to say? He says at one point, call down the line and say, ho, danger. Well, danger of what? I don't know. Just be careful.
Right.
Okay, great. I'll be careful. I've been being careful, you asshole. Like there's really not like a point of what could he have done. So it's an interesting dynamic there. Like, why was he given these warnings when he couldn't do anything about it? Or could he have?
It seems to me like it's his own caution that kills him, because he gets all these warnings and he's hypervigilant. And it seems to me like he's running towards it, trying to because that's what he does earlier in the story, is he runs towards it to try and figure out what it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's confronting the specter at the mouth of the tunnel. Well, to me, it seems like he's doing that again to try to prevent something from happening, and that's what his downfall is.
I see.
And before I forget about it, it seems like the narrator really has come to really like the Signal Man and has come to see him with a sense of endearment, because on the second to last page, there's actually great apropos about, that's not the right way to say it, but
Apropos?
yeah, right? I don't know, but I'm saying it. But in things that I read, they make a great big deal out of the fact that he says, I would extend my walk for an hour, I said to myself, half an hour on and half an hour back, and it would then be time to go see my signalman's box.
Oh.
Time to go to my signalman's box. I wonder, is that kind of not really a condescending thing, but for someone of a higher class?
Like my man, my butler, almost
right.
endearment.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But in kind of like a dominance way, you know what I mean? Like I'm a higher class than you.
Yeah, no.
So I'll use a certain, not pejorative, but what is it? Pedantic term?
Patronizing?
Yeah.
Do you have anything that is directly, so I know you've got all these academic resources for a lot of these things that we read. Do you have anything like that you kind of want to throw in before I have these tangential? You're
gonna drop these bombs, right?
I'm going somewhere else.
Okay. No, I don't. And what do you want to do? Our formal, we're going to talk about Charles Dickens after this, but do you want to do your formal summary or not summary, but your formal review and grade of this story?
I loved it. I would probably, just for the fact that the length and then maybe the fact that, as I said before, you're dropped into it and you're yanked out of it really quickly. There's not a lot of setup. And as an American reader, I tend to want my stories tied up in a little bow. So I could have used a little bit more. So maybe I would give it like a 4 out of 5 stars.
I give it a 5.5 because I like no bows. I like it just, it reminds me of Lewis Creed in Pet Sematary, where he does all these things to try and prevent the doom. So yeah, I'd give it a 4.5. I think it was great. And it's funny because I'm very aware that our episode is longer than it will take you to actually read this, but there's so much depth, with Charles Dickens, and there's a lot to unpack here.
Well, and I think I really love that you brought up that about the Pet Sematary, because, he's given a bunch of warnings in that too. Mm-hmm. Of what not to do, and he still goes ahead and does it anyway, which I think in a way is sort of like this story that the Signal Man's given all these warnings. The premonition of death, again, is another thing that we're going to see a lot in Gothic horror, and I just want to pull out these, what I think are sort of real life and literary premonitions of death. So one is that Charles Dickens himself was involved in a Staplehurst rail crash on June 9th, 1865. So he was in a train crash where a bunch of people did die. He wrote this story a year later, and not 5 years after this crash, he died on the exact same day. Like, he died of a stroke, which I know is not as scary as actually dying in like a second train crash or something. But I just thought it was crazy that, he was inspired by this story. And then, to the day, June 9th, 1865, he was in the crash. June 9th, 1870, he dies. Like, that to me is just creepy. Did he sort of have a premonition of his own death when he sort of wrote this story? Did he cheat death that first time with the train crash, the Staplehurst rail crash that he was involved in? I think it's a really interesting little thought project there. What do you think of that, Pat?
Yeah, that's crazy. I mean, I'm just looking up other famous premonitions of death for our episode here.
Well, I have another one. So just hold on. Hold on to your hats, bros. So we've mentioned Edgar Allan Poe a couple times. I think we're going to address a few of his works as we go on forward. The only thing that Poe wrote that was an actual full novel was called The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. This was written in 1838. I think this is another like premonition of a death, life imitating art moment. This is about like a whaling ship, mutiny, cannibals, mystery, like getting lost at sea, pirates. This is a very interesting story. And Jules Verne and Herman Melville were both influenced by this work. In 1884, there's a ship called I'm going to butcher this, the Mignonette. This is a real ship. But there is a mutiny, I believe. No, there's a crash. I can't remember. But a bunch of people die, and there are a few men left over that are in a rowboat, and they are about to die, and they end up cannibalizing the cabin boy. This directly reflects back to the book. And actually in the book, there is a cabin boy that is eaten to save the lives of the other members. But you guys want to get like totally freaked out? They have the same name. They're both called Richard Parker. And it wasn't like, this was pretty obscure of a novel. And the fact that I doubt that a boy was named after a cabin boy in this story. But even then, the fact that two cabin boys, both named Richard Parker, both were involved in these like huge accidents on whaling ships and both got eaten. That's like glitch in the Matrix stuff. So just a like small little note. This ended up setting like one of the first cases and a famous case called Regina versus Dudley and Stevens, which is like the Crown versus Dudley and Stevens, which were two of the men that ended up eating this boy. And it was murder for like the necessity of your life. So you can't kill somebody to save your life and expect it to not be like charged with murder.
Common law right there.
So I don't know. Those were the kind of things that I looked up. And then I went into one of those deep like YouTube, Google holes with Glitch in the Matrix and stumbled across these people telling their stories about how they predicted 9/11. So we don't have to go all the way there. But that's just the premonition of death just kind of got me thinking about life imitating art and people deja vu and this uncanny, eerie feeling of sensing something terrible, dreadful calamity is going to happen. And all of a sudden, I'm there reading about people dreaming about the Twin Towers falling 2 or 3 nights before they fell.
Just to, as we close up here, a few more fun ones maybe. So apparently, according to this, I'll put a link in the show notes page, kind of a trash website here with like a slideshow type thing. But number one, premonition of death, Kurt Cobain.
Ooh.
As a young student, Cobain allegedly once told a friend that he thought he'd become a rich and famous musician before ultimately committing suicide or being killed by his girlfriend.
Courtney
Love. After Nirvana's rise to fame, that's exactly what he did, took his own life or was murdered at his home on April 5th, 1994.
Pat.
What?
Was he murdered?
I don't know enough about it.
I think he was murdered.
Okay. Well.
ASMR. our stories.
Okay. Bob Marley. Few of his famed musicians' fans knew that he once told friends he believed he'd die when he was 36. He passed away in 1981 at the age of 36. This one is interesting. Mark Twain. Halley's Comet appeared the year Twain was born, prompting him to once state that he hoped he'd die the same year it came back around the Earth. I came in with Halley's Comet in 1835. It is coming again next year, and I expect to go out with it. The comet returned in 1910, and just one day later, Mark Twain passed away.
He did it on purpose.
I'm sure he did, the bastard. So another one here, Jimi Hendrix. Fans of the musician couldn't help but notice an eerie similarity between the lyrics of the Ballad of Jimmy. Now Jimmy's gone, he's not alone. His memory still lives on. 5 years, this he said, he's not gone, he's just dead. And Jimi Hendrix's accidental death 5 years after that song came out.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Creepy.
There's one about Tupac here thinking that he'd be shot and murdered, but I don't think that's a coincidence.
That's not sad. That's not laughed. Oh, okay, go ahead.
William Thomas Stead. This famed writer died aboard the Titanic in 1912, so it came as a shock when people learned he'd once written about a large group dying on a ship that didn't have enough lifeboats. He also once wrote of a ship crashing into an iceberg, killing all those aboard.
I love it. I could honestly read about that forever, even though, there's a couple things I was reading about, like synchronicity, and there's been a theory about quantum. I'm so out of my depth there, but it's some theory about like quantum something, and that when there's a higher fluctuation of it, people seem to be doing the same things or having the same thoughts all around the world.
Oh yeah, like vibes.
Yeah, and there's this like global like mindset thing, and we're all kind of tied into these magnetic fields and all of this stuff where the glitch in the matrix like makes more sense because of it. I can see if I can link something in the show notes so that you guys can actually read what it's about and not just hear my butchering of it. Anything else for the folks tonight, Pat?
Okay, a couple more if you'll indulge me. Jackie Wilson, he's a singer. During the famed 1958 song Lonely Teardrops, Wilson sang My Heart is Cryin', Cryin'. And then in 1975, while performing the song live, he suffered a heart attack while singing the words My Heart. Audience members thought it was just part of the act, but sadly it was not, and he was later pronounced dead. That's pretty bleak right there.
Yeah.
Abraham de Mauvrier, I don't like French, a famed mathematician, spent a great deal of his time wondering about death. At one point, he predicted that he'd pass on November 27th, 1754. And wouldn't you know it, that was the exact day he passed away while sleeping.
Well, sleeping's the way to go, I guess.
Yeah. Well, anyways, that's the end of that, but thanks for indulging us there. Next week, we're excited because this is the first episode that we've recorded after the show launched.
Yeah.
So the show is launched. It is now on iTunes and all of the major podcasting platforms. Check us out at unhallowedpodcast.com. We are on Instagram. We are on Twitter. We are on Goodreads, where I'm posting reviews and you can see
what we're reading,
what we're
going to read.
Mm-hmm. And we are also on Patreon. If you would like to support the show, go to unhallowedpodcast.com/Patreon. It'll take you there. We haven't set up the tiers yet, but by the time this episode launches, we will have set up some tiers for you guys to support the show and help us do what we do and keep the lights on, or dimmed, perhaps. Dim the lights. Get it? Because it's a Gothic podcast.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Haha. So
I'm here.
We really appreciate anything that you would consider supporting. It does cost money for our podcast hosting and to keep the website up and running, and to buy new equipment such as a mic boom that would keep vibrations from happening. We would really appreciate that. Next week, we will be reading The Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker. We're going to take a leap into the future because we watched Hellraiser.
My first time.
The first time?
First time I've ever seen it.
And I read some Clive Barker. We might have a special guest on even to help us discuss The Hellbound Heart. One of my friends is a big Clive Barker nut, so we're going to get him on to talk about The Hellbound Heart. Because, surprise, there's a million quintessential Gothic elements in this story. So I'm interested. I've read it, but Lizzie hasn't read it yet, but we both watched Hellraiser. So thanks again. Again, you can find the show notes at unhallowedpodcast.com/4. And we're really excited to speak with you guys again. Please remember to like, comment, subscribe, share the show. That's what's going to help us as we're such a young podcast.
And definitely give us feedback on what you enjoy, what you don't, and how we can improve. We would like to have you on this journey with us and, really begin a conversation about what you enjoy reading and what about the Gothic horror universe appeals to you. So thanks everybody for listening, for participating, and good night.
Good night.